So yeah, thank you very much for inviting us to the workshop and for the special issue and for the presentations this morning as well. I thought they were really interesting. I mean, our paper is bringing in, I think, some of the debate around Minsky that we had in the previous session, but particularly we're going to be looking at house price cycles, housing systems, and growth models. So what's the background for focusing on housing? I mean, firstly, I think since the 2008 financial crisis, there has been an increased interest in housing markets and household debt. And one thing we see in the literature is that debt financed consumption of households, is commonly identified as a source of financial instability in growth models, right? However, we think the actual role of housing and house prices in particular have not been kind of properly accounted for in the growth models debate. And so we want to provide some kind of theoretical synthesis for that. And there's three distinct literatures that we're going to be looking at in the paper and in the presentation. So the first is the growth models literature that obviously we've already cited, and particularly this idea of debt-driven or consumption-led growth that is very dominant in that literature. However, that really focuses on household debt, and it doesn't include an analysis of the housing stock or house prices. The second related literature is behavioral finance and the post-Keynesian Minskian literature, which does have quite a strong theoretical overview and account for the idea of endogenous house price cycles. So endogenous being the idea that booms endogenously lead to busts, which then leads to booms, and then particularly the idea of how those house price cycles can actually drive the business cycle, i.e. the cycle in GDP. However, these theories really are quite theoretical, and they don't take into account the substantial cross-country differences that we see in housing markets and house price dynamics. And so it's a third set of literature which has been kind of analyzed in comparative political economy, where housing institutions and the differences in housing markets and housing systems across country has been kind of systemically analyzed. But that literature, again, focuses primarily on politics, the politics of housing, and also primarily on household debt rather than the idea of house price cycles. So our contribution is, with each of these three streams, we think that these do provide useful insights, but they fall short of a coherent account of the role of housing in growth models. And so what we want to do in the paper is to provide a kind of combined framework in order to integrate housing into the growth model perspective. And we've kind of termed this notion the house price driven growth model, to give it kind of a label. And this really emphasizes the cyclicality of house prices. So the idea of those endogenous cycles, the idea that booms, this is a stylized feature of the house price. And then also we want to look at those cross-country differences. Why is it that some countries have very intense cycles and other countries don't? So in terms of what we do is, firstly, we critically review the role of housing in those three literatures. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more depth about the kind of gaps that we're trying to fill and synthesize in those literatures. In the second, we're going to offer a brief kind of theoretical synthesis to understand this idea of the house price cycle, the house price growth cycle, and their role in growth models. And then lastly, we're going to look at some preliminary cross-country evidence for our framework. So the three literatures, if we go back to the growth models literature, the concept of debt-driven or consumption-led growth is obviously been widely used to characterize some economies' growth models. Now, what this kind of does is this focus has really been on the idea of debt-financed consumption, right? And this is often kind of theorized as an idea of through kind of a theory of emulation, the idea that poorer households basically see the consumption of richer households, and they effectively want to imitate them, right? And so they'll go into debt, they'll spend beyond their means in order to do that, and that can kind of fuel a debt finance consumption boom. Now, there's three kind of issues with this story, or three shortcomings of the story. The first is that it doesn't take into account the role of kind of the collateral or the wealth of the housing stock as a driver of credit supply and credit demand. And then secondly, really, it ignores the importance of residential investment as a very significant and volatile component of private demand, right? An important component of investment, which itself is a component of private demand. And then lastly, we don't have an account of the endogeneity of the cycle in this story, right? There's no kind of theory about why a boom might lead to a bust, which might then lead to kind of a boom. Secondly, in the heterodox macro literature, this has focused very much on the idea of an endogenous cycle, right? So there's kind of two groups of the literatures. The first is a behavioral finance literature, where asset markets are prone to endogenous cycles. So it looks at many different assets. The Dietsch and Westerhoff papers and specifically look at housing. And in these models, basically agents they're bounded rationally and they follow simple heuristics. So we're not in the rational expectations actor of kind of neoclassical economics. Rather, you have kind of different agents. So you have momentum traders and fundamentalist traders. Momentum traders basically work on the idea of extrapolating from past trends. So if the price of houses are going up in the past, then we expect them to go up in the future, right? And so an increase in house prices can actually lead to an increase in the demand for houses. While the fundamentalist traders is the opposite. So if they see house prices going up, they think this is diverging from some kind of equilibrium value. And at some point, those prices are going to go down. And that interaction between those two traders generates the endogenous cycle. And there's different variations of this, but this is the kind of basic story. The post-Keynesian Minskian literature I think one of the key things it does is it takes an idea of an endogenous house price or asset price market cycle, in this case a house price cycle, and then it kind of includes how that will impact the business cycle, right? How that will impact the cycle in GDP. And I think one of the key channels it does this is through the residential investment demand, as I've said. So housing booms drive residential investment, but they also create financial fragility because households become increasingly indebted. And then secondly, these kind of house price booms can actually lead to growth via wealth effects or via collateral effects is another kind of channel which this literature highlights. So these are interesting models, and I think they provide a very kind of rigorous framework to understand endogenous cycles. But what they don't do is they don't really look at why some countries might have a particularly volatile cycle or an intense cycle, and other countries might not, and how that might relate to institutions and how that might relate to political issues in different countries, right? So this is a kind of shortcoming of this literature. And so lastly, it's this comparative political economy literature that kind of can fill that gap in the sense of it has looked at very significant cross-country differences in housing systems. So you have the Schwartz and the Seabrook paper, which has the idea of the varieties of residential capitalism. And I think there's others. Fuller in 2015 looks at other types of institutions. There's two primary, the literature basically says differences in housing systems are driven by kind of mainly two institutions. On the one hand, you have differences in home ownership rates. Some countries are very low home ownership rates, others are very high ones. And then on the other hand, you have a set of institutions which are about the accessibility of mortgage finance. So for example, capital gains taxation. If you have very high capital gains taxation, then you might not have particularly volatile cycles because people can't really speculate on the market. One shortcoming of this, however, of the literature is that it's focused mainly on political outcomes, and its focus has been really on household debt rather than the endogenous house price cycles that were discussed in the Minskian literature. So that's a broad overview of those three different literatures. How then do we integrate them into the growth models approach? So our framework, kind of in a nutshell, is that house prices are key drivers in finance-led growth models. Okay, so places like the UK in this. House prices are a key driver, and this happens through those two channels that haven't really been properly analyzed in the growth models literature, which is one is the residential investment channel, and then the other is the wealth effects channel. The idea, if your house price increases in value, you feel like you're richer, and so you consume more. And so this can lead to house price driven growth. The second part of our nutshell is that these are inherently cyclical, as I've said, and that these endogenous cycles are due to speculative behavior. And then lastly, we kind of posit that the intensity of these cycles will in some sense depend on those institutions that CPE have highlighted, right? So you would expect more intense house price cycles in countries where there's very easy access to credit and where there's a lot of home ownership rates. Because in those countries, as I'll show you in this graph here, maybe we could talk through I'll talk through the causal channels now, but in those countries, effectively, you're going to have more speculative demand. So the way it works is something like this. You have different countries that have different levels of private home ownership and mortgage credit institutions. Those countries that have very lax, very much accessibility to mortgage credit and high private home ownership have very high speculative demand for housing. That has very intense house price cycles. And then that can then lead to kind of volatile debt finance consumption and kind of booms and busts in that. But it can also lead to mortgage finance residential investment, right? Which in turn can lead to this cyclical house price driven growth model. So what evidence is there for this kind of framework? So what we do is we conduct turning point analysis on 32 OECD countries from 1970 to 2019. A turning point analysis it comes from Harding and Pagan, but it's been used by Drayman and Claessens in particularly for house prices. Basically, what it does is you follow an algorithm to determine peaks and troughs of the house price series. So, for example, in 2008, many countries had a peak of house prices, right? It was a period where it was the end of a really big boom, and then house prices crashed. And so what you do is you identify these peaks and troughs within a 10-quarter window of the peak and the trough, and you impose some kind of standard constraints on the algorithm. One is that the length of a cycle has to be the minimum of 5 years, so you're not just capturing very small changes in the house price series. And with that, you can measure three things. First is the duration of the house price cycle. So this is how long is the cycle between boom and boom, or between bust and bust. Secondly is the amplitude, which is the percentage change, i.e. how big is the cycle, right? How in percentage changes, how much of house prices increased in the boom, or how much have they declined in the bust? And then the slope is just the amplitude divided by the duration. So it's the percentage change kind of per year. And we're taking the slope to measure the intensity of the cycle in a way. So for example, on average, our cycles in our model across these 30 countries is the booms are basically 8.7 years on average, busts are roughly around 5.7 years. And so on average, it's about 7.5 years. While booms, basically in a boom, house prices on average increase by around 50%, while in a bust, house prices decline by around 35%. So we can see that booms are bigger than busts. And then but on the other hand, because booms are also longer than busts, it means that the slope of booms, or the intensity of the boom, is actually smaller than busts, where actually it's quite surprising, in a bust, house prices decline by on average 7.4% in real terms every year, right? So quite a significant shock, something we might be feeling in the UK, hopefully not over the next coming months. So average slopes of booms in house price cycles against busts. Basically, this graph, if you can see, on the y-axis you have booms, and on the x-axis you have the bust, and this is the intensity, this is the slope of the bust, right? So what you can see here is firstly that there's quite a significant cross-country differences. So if you look at here, you've got a country like Germany, which has over this 1970 to 2019 period, it's had pretty small, the intensity of the cycles have been quite small in both the booms and the busts. While in Estonia, up here, you can see that the busts in Estonia have been absolutely huge, over 30% drops in house prices per year, while also the booms of Estonia has been very big. And what we can see is that across the sample, there's clearly a relationship between booms and busts, right? Countries that have particularly intense booms also have particularly intense busts. And so we think in a way this does support the Minskian notion of an endogenous cycle, right? There's significant cross-country differences, and booms in some sense lead to busts, right? There's a correlation here between the two. What we have in this graph is the share of countries in a house price boom or a house price bust. So I think if you kind of look at the red circle, this is the period around the 2008 financial crisis. And what you can see is in those years in the early 2000s, over 80% of OECD countries were in a boom. So during this period, you can see that there is some synchronization of the house price cycle across countries, right? Over 80% of those countries are in a boom, and then it led to the dash line, I should say, is busts. You have around 75% of countries during the financial crisis are in a bust. So we do have some synchronization. However, before that, really, there's not as much of a clear story. Let's skip ahead. And then lastly, we could look at different country groupings of the intensity of house price cycles. If you look at the gray graphs here, we have the intensity of cycles on average between 1995 to 2019. We can see that there's, again, very significant cross-country differences. And it's maybe in line with some of the things we might expect, right? The European core has, for example, quite low cycles, while Anglo-Saxon countries have much more intense cycles. So that's some stylized facts really about house price cycles. Let's just think back to the idea of our theoretical framework, which is that we argued that really countries, for this idea of the house price growth model to make sense, it must be the case that countries with particularly intense house price cycles must also have particularly intense business cycles. And that's what we're trying to show. Well, that's what we show on the left-hand graph, because on the y-axis here, we have the slope or the intensity of house prices. And on the x-axis, we have the slope of real GDP. Okay, and the slope of real GDP is done in a similar way in using a turning point algorithm to determine the business cycle slopes. And what we can see is, if we just plot a line through these graphs, is we can see that there's, again, quite a clear positive correlation. In other words, countries with more volatile housing cycles also have more volatile business cycles. So this is preliminary evidence for the idea of the house price growth model. On the right-hand graph, we have the slope of house prices against the slope of household debt. And again, we see this very significant and positive correlation, which again kind of supports the idea that we're having some interaction between household debt and house price cycles in the wider kind of financial cycle of a country. So yeah, this supports the idea of a house price driven growth. What we have here is, again, what was our argument? One of our key arguments was that the idea of residential investment has been maybe not given the attention it deserved as a key driver from house prices to growth. And what we show here is that countries with more volatile housing markets on the y-axis, this is the slope or the intensity of house prices, also are countries which have a greater higher than average growth contribution of investment. So this is the contribution of to growth of investment. And so we can see that there is again quite a significant correlation here, and that is positive, which supports the residential investment channel. Lastly, I'm just going to show two more graphs. What was our third thing we were arguing, bringing the CPE literature in? It's that these differences, these cross-country differences in the intensity of house price cycles can in some sense be driven by differences in institutions. So this institution here on the x-axis is home ownership rates against, again, the intensity of house price cycles. And we find that countries with higher home ownership rates have much more intense booms and busts. And then lastly, we find that countries, the second institution of mortgage encouragement. So this is an index that comes from CPA. Basically, higher values mean more accessibility to mortgages. We can see again that there's a significant and positive correlation, right? The p-value here is 0.03. And so countries where it's easier to get access to mortgage credit also have more intense house price cycles. So in conclusion, house price dynamics are key to growth models. The house prices are cyclical, and this is, and their intensity differs quite substantially across countries. We believe that these cross-country differences are related to differences in institutions, and particularly high home ownership rates and easy access to mortgage credit are more likely to experience unstable house price driven growth. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. Well in time.